We are the Reddish family from Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio.
You are listening to Two Broads Talking Politics with special guest Jared Yates Sexton.
Roses are red, the future is blue. Let's unseat Republicans and impeach Trump too.
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, and we're doing a special first time ever emergency broadcast of the podcast. For obvious reasons today, the Mueller Report, redacted Mueller Report, was released finally. So I am joined tonight by Jared Yates Sexton, who is an author, political commentator, and a professor. Hi, Jared.
Hey, how's it going, Kelly?
Great. Thanks for joining me. Kind of a slow news day today.
I can't even imagine what we would fill the time with.
Yeah, I don't remember anymore. So listeners may note that Sophie is not on with us. When the Barr memo dropped, I was on the road, and now the Mueller report comes out, and she's on the road. So I'm thinking if you want to find out when things like impeachment or resignation might happen, just look for our travel schedules. All right. So, Jared, you had quite a popular Twitter thread today about the Mueller report that I thought was really good at sort of laying out some of the things that were in it. It's 448 pages, I think. I will admit I have not read every word. Probably a lot of people have not read every word. So I want to sort of talk about what some of the big takeaways are, what some of the things people should maybe be thinking about as they look at it, and, sort of what your reaction to it is. But maybe just to take a tiny step back, could you talk a little bit about, sort of your background in covering this stuff?
Sure. So I am by trade, I am a fiction writer, and I've dabbled in politics. I've worked a little bit in it. I've covered politics a little bit. But I actually started covering politics in 2016 sort of as a way to get away from a novel that was failing. And so I started going into like Trump rallies, and I didn't expect it to be anything more than like a side thing. And I suddenly found myself pulled into one of these weird viral moments that now happen with the internet. And I had a second career open up. And since then, I've been writing about politics, all over the place. I covered the 2016 campaign for a few months there for the New Republic. I contributed to the New York Times. And since then, like I said, it's sort of become this second career that I didn't really expect to have. But, here we are.
All right. So the Mueller report. So we had this very odd situation this morning that first we had the Barr press conference before anyone had seen the redacted report, and then the report itself was released. Did you watch the press conference as well?
Unfortunately, I did. I think I gained a few gray hairs in the process. That it was a really bad way to start a morning and a bad way to start this whole process, to see the Attorney General of the United States obviously misrepresent something so badly and to completely fail in terms of his constitutional duties and oaths. It was obvious from the very, very beginning that this was a political spin that he was putting on this report. And, we've been hearing these leaks that have been coming out, and it's become more and more obvious that Barr is doing whatever Trump tells him and whatever helps this administration. And this morning was just a incredibly infuriating and frustrating moment, I think, in American history.
Do you think, we don't necessarily know yet, but do you think that it served the purpose he was trying to serve, whatever that might have been? I think most people that I follow on Twitter, most people that I talk to, just sort of thought, this guy sounds like a defense attorney, I'm going to wait and read it myself. But do you think that the spin attempt will work with certain segments of the population?
Well, the MO of the Trump experience from the very beginning has been this divided reality. And Donald Trump and the people around him are very aware that in the partisan divide that we have now, in these little reality bubbles that we no longer share, all you have to do is give your base a story, right? It doesn't matter if that story is particularly well crafted. We've seen that with the QAnon nonsense that just falls apart during, even a little bit of examination. But if you give them some sort of a cover story, they'll accept it because of cognitive dissonance. And I think that's all that was. That was Trump getting out ahead of it. He sent out an email last night that was a fundraising email that basically said that the Mueller report had been released multiple times, which is just blatantly false. But, for people who don't pay as close of attention or who have a personal investment in believing his lies, that cover story is very powerful. But for everyone else, I don't think anyone else bought what Barr was selling today.
So then the report itself came out, and of course it was initially released as a non-searchable image PDF, not a text. I quickly ran it through OCR. I imagine a lot of other people did too. So eventually it was clean text that we could read, and it's 448 pages. Parts of it are very heavily redacted. What are sort of your initial main takeaways? And we can sort of dive into some of them, but what's sort of the highlights, do you think, of the report?
Well, I think one of the reasons I was able to sort of get a hold of this thing and sort of digest it quickly is I have this background where I've had to learn how to sort of speed read large documents. So I think a lot of people, like you said, sort of ran this thing through where they could sort of search it. And so, you're looking for the highs and the lows and the peaks and the valleys, right? I think everybody immediately typed Donald Trump Jr. or Russia or something. But I looked through this thing, and it became pretty obvious, I would say, when I got into the 40 or 50 page range, it started to become very obvious that Mueller had written this report as a narrative to lay the foundation for further investigations. There was a pretty consistent tone of an underlying rhetoric that Mueller was saying that he had been stymied in his investigation in multiple ways. Basically, the DOJ had limited him in terms of time and scope, and had basically interfered all along, and that Trump and his associates had stonewalled him in his collecting of materials. So what ended up becoming pretty apparent immediately was that this report was to Congress and to the American people. And so when that sort of became apparent, the entire scope of the investigation became readily apparent that he had found evidence of both collusion and also obstruction, but based upon the Department of Justice's laws and precedents, he couldn't indict a sitting president. And so he basically was putting this out there for someone else to either carry on the investigation or for Congress to make a decision. And when you look at it through that perspective, as opposed to why didn't Robert Mueller arrest Donald Trump and lead him out in handcuffs, that sort of opens up the scope of the thing, and you start to realize that there's a much larger thing happening within this investigation, within this report, and automatically it's a really damning report. I mean, there are so many instances of Trump campaign officials actively working with Russian interests. The first thing that really popped out to me was that it seems like everybody within the Trump campaign knew beforehand that WikiLeaks was going to release the Democratic emails. They had, I believe it was a 25 to a 30-page strategy guide for how they were going to capitalize on the release. Donald Trump himself apparently knew ahead of time and was making calls to tell people when it was going to be released. Though he might not have had the trail that led from Trump and his associates to WikiLeaks, and maybe he still does because we're still looking at, Roger Stone being investigated, it becomes readily apparent that over here with collusion, there's still a live spark within it. And when you start looking at that, and then you start going into the obstruction, it's pretty obvious that this is a volatile powder keg, so to speak.
As I was trying to skim it, it felt like a lot of it was really familiar. A lot of it was stuff that we basically already knew, even if it hadn't been put all together in one document. Did you feel that, you have followed this stuff even more closely than I have. Did you feel that way as well? Were there things in there that were surprising to you?
No, I absolutely felt that way. It's really incredible now looking back how many of these crimes were committed in the full view of the public. It's amazing now. I'll never forget watching Donald Trump appeal to Russia to find Hillary Clinton's emails, right, on live television. And just the fact that happened in public, and they can sort of pretend like it was a joke, so to speak, but that's actual an attempt at collusion. And then we find out in the report that there were other entreaties made by Trump and his associates to try and gain that material right after that. And not to mention that Mueller actually found that Russia responded to his press conference call to find the emails. I mean, that is just harrowing stuff that we were all witness to. But yeah, it was very familiar in so many different ways. But the thing that got me that was most shocking was the obstruction case that got laid out. And basically you saw blow by blow how not only did Donald Trump actively obstruct justice and occasionally was successful, but how many attempts he had that were ultimately not successful. And you see these people in his orbit, like Chris Christie and Reince Priebus and Don McGahn, who actively had to deny his request for them to do something illegal and to obstruct justice, which, opens up a lot more avenues of obstruction, because you don't have to succeed in order for it to be obstruction. You only have to have intent. It was shocking in black and white just how dead to rights Mueller actually had him.
One of the things that I think is a little bit confusing, and this was one of the things that Sophie had wanted me to bring up, was there's this question of whether or not the underlying crime is established, whether that matters in terms of obstruction. So even if you can't prove the crime, people always say it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. Well, the cover-up seems pretty clear. The intent seems pretty clear. But there seems to be this reluctance to do something about it because we can't prove the crime. How do you sort of tease those things out in your reading of this report?
I don't have the slightest idea how this thing's going to work out, because I actually feel like there's a larger societal thing at play here, which is when you actually start looking at laws and systems and institutions, there's a lot of variance to them. It all depends on how people perceive them. It depends upon, it depends on rhetoric. It depends on perspective. In all of this, it's actually kind of incredible to be able to look at this and say, okay, and did you watch Barr this morning?
Parts of it. I couldn't stomach the whole thing.
There was this amazing moment, and you might have seen it, which I think plays into all of this, which is William Barr, who up until now, I think a lot of people have considered a very serious person. He floated the idea that Donald Trump might have committed I'm trying not to go colorblind explaining this. He tried to explain that Donald Trump might have obstructed justice, but it wasn't actually obstruction of justice, because when he obstructed justice, he was doing so because he was so frustrated that he was being charged with a fake crime. And that's one of the most ludicrous things you've ever heard. But, when you actually look at lawyers and the way that they interpret the law is malleable, right? We like to believe that it's black and white and everything is open and shut, but all of this stuff is malleable. And so now, again, we live in this country where there's such a divide in terms of politics and perspective that people live in different worlds. So to take this situation, which is the most postmodern situation since the white and blue dress, to take this now and sort of start to examine it, it's all in the eye of the beholder. And ultimately it's going to come down to whether or not Congress or Democrats or Republicans can sort this thing out in the long run. And I don't think that anybody knows right now whether or not that can happen, or whether anybody can even start to come to a consensus on anything.
So I have a 7-year-old, and I think that the way that William Barr was describing Trump is precisely how a 7-year-old acts. I can easily imagine Teddy being well, it was okay for me to do all of this because I was mad.
No, that's exactly right. And, that was another alarming thing is, we're all now subjected to this 24/7, round the clock palace drama of people talking about how hard it is to deal with Trump and to make sure that he does this and make sure that he eats his vegetables or whatever it is. It's all very childish. But the other part of the report and a large section of the obstruction section is very, very dedicated to the people in Trump's orbit having to work overtime to basically keep him from being not just a criminal president, but an overtly criminal president. And it has this very juvenile quality to it that I actually think it's very harrowing to think that the president of the United States, the person who is in control of the armed forces and our nuclear arsenal, is effectively, sort of a disquiet baby. I think that's really frightening.
Yeah. One of the things that seemed like somewhat new information, at least, was this idea that Manafort was talking to the Russians or a Russian about particular states that, in fact, ended up swinging the election. What do you think of that piece of it? I know it's one of the things you mentioned in your thread on Twitter. You know, how alarming should this be to us?
Oh, it's incredibly alarming. That was another one of the revelations that I think were most shocking from this whole thing. We've known all along that Manafort provided polling data to Russia, which is like one of those unsung controversies that has not gotten all the play in the press it deserves because this administration is, a scandal a day, if not two scandals a day, and things get lost in the cracks in the meantime. But to find out that Manafort discussed not only swing states, but the swing states that actually determined the 2016 election, and which were so surprising that they went for Donald Trump despite what everyone had projected and expected, I think there's plenty of fodder there to wonder just what happened with that information, just what happened with the polling data, what happened with the identification of the polling or the swing states. I think there's a lot of meat on that bone, and unfortunately, I think that might be one of the things that falls through the cracks. But I think it definitely deserves a little bit more investigation.
And investigation then by whom? I mean, what should we maybe expect from this? Mueller has closed up shop. That part's all done. So where do we go from here?
Well, I'm going to be honest. We're about a half hour out from Hoyer telling a reporter offhandedly that he isn't even considering impeachment and or impeachment inquiries, which I think is, to be honest, appalling. This is one of those situations where the Constitution says explicitly it is the duty of the House of Representatives to impeach a president who has committed high crimes and misdemeanors. This president has obviously, if not committed high crimes, there is the prospect of this president committing high crimes. And if they don't open an impeachment inquiry or an actual serious focused investigation that takes over where Mueller left off, and especially in an environment where they're doing so because they have their eyes on the next presidential election and they don't want to mess with the rhetoric and the plan, I think that's really upsetting. And I think that Democrats owe it to their constituents and they owe it to their country and their oaths to take this thing seriously the way that the framers would have expected them to. And so I think investigation absolutely has to be taken over by Congress the way that Robert Mueller obviously intended them to.
I guess one of the things that congressional Democrats are probably thinking about is sort of playing that out to the end game, right? So you have impeachment. We know that it's unlikely that it would be that he would be found guilty in the Senate, given the current makeup of the Senate. I mean, we can hope that maybe Senate Republicans now would be as courageous as Senate Republicans in Nixon's time would have been. But, I'm not sure we're there. So you've been to Trump rallies. You've seen the Trump campaign up close. What would happen if he is found not guilty in the Senate? I mean, how damaging would that be to us, no matter how much comes out in these investigations?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. The first thing is, obviously, a president has never been fully impeached and removed from office. We've had Andrew Johnson, we've had Bill Clinton, and both of those actually, although they failed, they both they set a precedent for the future. Congress set guideposts for future presidents to understand how they were supposed to act and how they weren't supposed to act. And so even though those impeachments weren't necessarily successful, I think those signals are really, really important in terms of pinning in power and making sure that presidents know how to behave and how not to behave. So I think that's important anyway. I also think that I think politics are malleable. And so obviously right now, if the Democrats voted to impeach, everyone would say, well, the Republicans would never vote to convict in the Senate. And that may be true, but things change constantly. And if there was an impeachment, God knows how the public would react and how the American people would react. And there's always a chance that, it could light a fire that could eventually, cause a change. But that being said, I think impeachment, and I have to say that, when I talk about impeachment, I talk about Trump needing to be removed from office, I do so really somberly. It really frightens me because I'll be honest, going to these rallies and knowing Trump supporters the way I do, either way, whether or not he would be impeached and removed from office or impeached and ultimately not convicted, it would be a really dangerous time period in this country. If Donald Trump were to be held responsible for what he's done, unfortunately, we've seen that he reacts to threats by, releasing the hound, so to speak, and having his supporters, turning up the rhetoric and having them threaten people and sometimes actually hurting people. I think we're in a really, really dangerous time. And whatever happens, I think that it's a really dangerous, anxious time. But I still think it's really, really important that Democrats exercise their constitutional duty and see this thing through, because if they don't, if we set a precedent that all of this is okay, I really don't know where that leads.
All right. Well, on that exciting note, I agree. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that we sort of walk away from this first pass at the Mueller report with, and any further thoughts that you want to make sure that we share?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, and this is something that breaks my heart almost every single day watching all of this unfold, it's that this is not a television show. This isn't, this isn't something that we watch unfold. Like the government is supposed to be in the thrall to its people. There's a social contract that's supposed to fall, and citizens are supposed to be in charge of the country. It's not simply just characters that we're watching interact and passion plays that are playing out. I think the news occasionally treats occasionally, I think every day they treat it like it's a sporting event where, the Democrats won today and the Republicans lost today, and they won and they lost. And I think that's a really sad way to view all of this. And I think that the American people should be outraged, not only that the democratic process was perverted and tainted, but that there have been these crimes committed that were obviously to conceal crimes from them. I think when we look at that and we change our perspective and look at this as the government is supposed to, work for us and we're supposed to be active participants, I think when you change that paradigm, you start to realize that this is an actual crisis and that everything has been turned upside down, and it's been upside down for a while. And I think that looking at it through like a little bit of a different perspective makes all the difference and makes this actually something that can be addressed and something that can be improved upon. But meanwhile, if it's a spectator thing, I don't think that happens.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and we're all going to get really caught up in sort of debating whether or not it's politically expedient to impeach, and there's going to be a lot of that conversation going on for a while now.
I'm already exhausted by it.
Yeah. Yes, and at the same time that we need to be thinking about all of that, of course, we also have upcoming Senate races, and there's all sorts of things, of course, to focus on at any given moment. But this does seem to be sort of a crisis point for our country that we need to take really seriously.
I think that's true, and I think that, and you just brought it up, right? There's going to be so many rallies and speeches and events, and on top of that, like I just had a moment a couple hours ago, I don't know if you had it as well, but I was like, there are going to be so many Senate hearings. There's going to be a day where Robert Mueller is on TV for like 6 hours, and a day where William Barr is on TV for like 6 hours, and Trump is going to have all this stuff. And participatory democracy is exhausting, more so than ever. But I think this is one of those times where we have to be vigilant and we have to be tireless, or else this thing's going to get a whole lot worse.
All right. Well, Jared, thank you so much for doing the important work of reading the whole thing. and thank you so much for your thoughtful comments on the report and where we go from here.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Mueller, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast.